Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep today into one of the most, well, outlandish, bizarre, and yet utterly foundational pieces of classical ballet history.
It really is.
If you thought the narrative structures of Swan Lake or maybe Giselle were complex, you should just prepare yourself for a 4-hour opium-fueled time-traveling spectacle.
All set in ancient Egypt, of
Of
course.
course. We're talking about Marius Petipa's 1862 Grand Ballet, The Pharaoh's Daughter.
It's just the ultimate fusion of 19th century European exoticism, this kind of archaeological fever that was gripping everyone, and critically a fantasy that is literally enabled by psychotropic drugs.
Right, and the titles alone sort of hint at the scale we're talking about.
They do. You have Doc Pharaoh in Russian or La Fille
Mhm.
de Pharaon in French. This thing was absolutely monumental. It was Petipa's very first full-scale multi-act grand ballet staged for the legendary St. Petersburg Imperial Theaters.
And when you say monumental, you really, really mean it.
Oh, absolutely. We mean it.
I mean, just the sheer scale is almost unimaginable by today's standards. Our sources lay out this truly bizarre setup right from the very beginning. The story is anchored in, 19th century reality. You've got an English nobleman, Lord Wilson, and his entourage, and they're sheltering in a pyramid.
Right. But the central action, the whole four-act spectacle of ancient Egyptian love and drama, that's all a fantasy. It's triggered by the nobleman consuming opium.
Yeah, it's not just some simple dream sequence. It's the fundamental engine of the whole narrative that just transports the audience across millennia.
Exactly. And this production wasn't just big, it was maximalist. We're looking at a 4-hour runtime.
4 hours.
4 hours. It required an immense number of resources. The staging used every single style and technique available to the Imperial Ballet at the time. It required something like 400 people on stage at once.
400.
This was choreography, a grand spectacle, which is a term they used to describe this specific genre of ballet that sort of mirrored the immense, really over-the-top productions you'd see in grand opera.
So it's all about strong, dramatic contrasts, colossal sets.
In these immense casts, yeah.
That context is so vital. We have to remember, this ballet was created to just overwhelm your senses.
And the creative team was absolutely top tier for the era. The score, which is so lush and dramatic, was by Cesare Pugni. He was one of the most prolific ballet composers of his day.
And the libretto, so the script and the storyline for the ballet, that was a collaboration between Jules-Henri Verneuil de Saint-Georges and Petipa himself.
But they didn't just invent the story out of thin air. They based it on the popular literary exoticism of the time, specifically a novel by Théophile Gautier called Le Roman de la Momie.
The Romance of the Mummy.
Exactly. And that book had already captured the European imagination with its blend of, historical detail and very high romance.
The premiere details really emphasize how important this work was to the St. Petersburg cultural calendar. It took place January 30th, 1862, at the Imperial Bolshoi Kameny Theater.
And the Imperial Theater spared no expense. I mean, the designers A. Roller and G. Wagner for scenery, Kelhor and Stolikov for costumes. Their job was to create this massive, detailed, ancient world that would just engulf the audience for 4 hours straight.
And the original cast list is basically a historical marker in itself.
Oh, for sure. It featured Marius Petipa himself. He was dancing the principal male role of Lord Wilson, who, once he's transported back in time, transforms into this ancient Egyptian man, Tahor.
And opposite him.
Opposite him was the legendary Italian ballerina Carolina Rosati. She performed the incredibly demanding role of the mummy who becomes a Specia.
And the supporting cast is just a who's who of the Imperial ballet system at the time. You have Nicholas Goltz as the Pharaoh. Timofey Stukolkin played this very specific, very British supporting role of the servant, John Bull.
John Bull, the national caricature.
Exactly. And Luba Verdina was Ramzaya. Even Felix Trzynski, who was the father of the very famous ballerina Matilda Trzynskaya, he was in the original cast as the vengeful king of Nubia.
What's so fascinating here is that even with this fantastical, almost ridiculous premise, you have the English lord, the comic servant, the guide, the opium, the premiere was recorded as an enormous success.
And not just successful.
No, it immediately became the most popular work in the entire repertoire of the Imperial Ballet. It sustained dozens of revivals over the next 50 years.
So this really brings us to our core mission for today. What does this all mean? How does such an unusual, sprawling, and frankly structurally chaotic premise become the defining spectacle of early Russian classical ballet?
It's just a profound testament to Petipa's genius, his ability to take that literary exoticism of the moment and transform it into this massive, structurally innovative choreographic machine that would define the shape of classical ballet we still see today.
And to really understand the foundation of that machine, we absolutely have to dive into the plot details themselves.
Yes, because the specifics of the fantasy are just vital.
Okay, let's jump right into the narrative then, because the details are, well, they're spectacular, they're full of high drama, and they're absolutely essential for understanding why this work, despite its outlandish structure, just endured.
The sources give us a wonderful walkthrough, starting right in the 19th century.
Right, the scene opens on an African safari. Lord Wilson, our English nobleman, his servant John Bull, and their guide are all looking for refuge from this massive, violent sandstorm, a simum.
They're basically tourists sheltering from the elements inside a newly discovered Egyptian pyramid.
And right here is where we get the first hint of the dramatic tension. They start making noise inside this ancient tomb, and the guide immediately tells them to be quiet.
Out of respect.
Out of respect for the pyramid's occupant. The nobleman is told that Aspasia, who is the pharaoh's daughter, is lying somewhere in a coffin right inside that pyramid. The dead are always present in this kind of Egyptian romance.
And to pass the long hours while they're waiting for the storm to die down, the guide makes this fateful offer. He gives Lord Wilson some opium.
And this isn't just a casual detail, is it? It's the definitive catalyst for everything that happens next.
Absolutely. Once the nobleman takes the opium, the supernatural transition begins with this instantaneous, almost hallucinogenic speed. The mummies that are littered around the pyramid's chambers start to stir, they come alive.
And then Aspasia, the pharaoh's daughter, dramatically rises from her coffin, which is right there, center stage.
This is the critical moment of transformation. Aspasia lays her hand over Lord Wilson's heart, which establishes this link across time. And Lord Wilson, the English traveler, instantly dissolves into the ancient Egyptian man, Tahor.
So he hasn't just dreamed a past life. He is literally living a past life, and it's all enabled by this substance.
Exactly. And now we are firmly in ancient Egypt, and the adventure begins immediately.
Right away. Tahor, the nobleman's ancient alter ego, is introduced as a hero. He saves Aspasia from a lion, which must have been a piece of pure, thrilling stage spectacle.
Oh, I can only imagine. And naturally, they fall passionately in love. This is where the central romantic conflict is established, and it has to be strong enough to sustain a 4-hour production.
So, of course, there's a problem.
There's always a problem. Aspasia, the title character, is already promised in marriage to the formidable king of Nubia.
This sets up the classic love triangle and the central chase that fills up so much of the middle acts. Tahor and Aspasia, they flee the palace.
And they are pursued relentlessly by the enraged Nubian king and his guards. They try to seek refuge and hide out in the secluded fisherman's inn near the Nile, just to rest and try to evade their pursuers.
And tragedy almost strikes right here. Tahor goes out with the local fishermen on a trip, and he leaves Aspasia behind at the inn, thinking she's safe.
A very bad move, as it turns out. The Nubian king and his men, they eventually stop at the very same inn for a rest. And, of course, they immediately discover the hiding princess.
So, faced with capture and this forced marriage, Aspasia makes the most dramatic, theatrical decision imaginable.
She doesn't just surrender.
No. Rather than be taken, she dashes out and throws herself into the swirling, legendary waters of the Nile River.
She jumps into the Nile.
Right into the Nile, just to escape the king's guards. And this move, this act of desperation, allows for the next massive choreographic set piece.
And this is where Petipa just indulges in pure choreographic fantasy. This is the famous Kingdom of the River sequence.
So Aspasia sinks to the bottom of the Nile,
where she's met by the majestic spirit of the Nile.
The visual opportunities here for elaborate stagecraft and lighting, which were a huge part of this grand spectacle style, they must have just been breathtaking.
I'm picturing it. And the spirit of the Nile is a demanding host, I take it.
A demanding but generous one. He hosts a massive welcome for the princess. He summons the great rivers of the world to dance for Aspasia.
The great rivers of the world.
All of them, all dressed up in elaborate national costumes, showcasing different styles of movement. The sources specifically mention the rivers ranging from, like, the sun-drenched Guadalquivir in Spain all the way to the icy Neva in Russia. Wait, so there's a dance for a Spanish river and a Russian river at the bottom of the Nile in Egypt?
Exactly. It's a massive, dazzling, and utterly illogical dance pageant. It happens purely for the purpose of a stunning divertissement.
So the spirit of the Nile then complicates the plot by telling her she has to stay. She's now a resident of his magical river kingdom.
Right. And Aspecia has to beg and ask for one special wish: to be brought back to land and returned to the mortal world so she can rejoin her love, Tahor. The romantic imperative has to triumph over the supernatural command.
And while all this underwater drama is happening, back on land.
Back on land, Tahor and the fishermen return to the inn, only to find Aspecia gone. And the Nubian king, who is utterly furious that his prize has escaped, captures Tahor and drags him back to the pharaoh's palace
To face punishment.
for daring to kidnap the princess and defy the royal betrothal.
The climax is just pure, unadulterated, high drama. It's exactly what the grand spectacle demanded, isn't it?
Absolutely. Tahor is brought before the pharaoh and sentenced to the most Egyptian of deaths.
A cobra bite.
But Aspecia, having been released from the river kingdom, arrives just in time. She's often brought back to the palace by the same fishermen who helped them escape earlier.
And she walks in just as the execution is about to happen.
She does. She grabs the cobra and threatens to let it bite her as well. She declares in this huge dramatic high point that if Tahor dies, she dies.
Which is a move the sources explicitly noted was recognized by the audience as a classic gesture since Cleopatra's time, referencing the famous suicide by asp.
Exactly. The audience would have gotten that reference immediately.
And this action, this immediate and dramatic display of ultimate self-sacrifice, finally breaks the pharaoh's resolve.
The pharaoh pulls his daughter back from the cobra. He grants permission for her and Tahor to marry, and the enraged Nubian king storms off, swearing revenge but ultimately defeated. It's the ultimate romantic victory played out on the grandest possible scale.
And here's the genius of the opium catalyst. Everyone starts to celebrate the wedding and the happy resolution and a grand final divertissement. But just as the celebration reaches its peak, the opium dream ends.
Snap. It's over.
Tahor instantly, abruptly transforms back into Lord Wilson, the English nobleman, still inside the dark, dusty pyramid.
It's such a neat narrative device. It allows the audience to experience this enormous, fantastical epic and then just pulls the rug out from under them, reminding them it was all internal.
And the nobleman is leaving the pyramid with his servant John Bull, but he looks back at Aspecia's coffin, remembering the love that they shared and still share. It leaves you with this enduring feeling that the love was real, even if the adventure was, well, chemically induced.
It connects the 19th century present to the ancient past through the emotional permanence of the experience, which is justified by the fantastic nature of the dream state. And that emotional core is really what sustained the production, despite the chaotic structure.
The plot, as sprawling and detailed as it is, really just served as the vehicle for Petipa's real breakthrough. This ballet wasn't just a popular hit, it was a career detonator.
It was a structural milestone for classical ballet.
Absolutely. We have to understand the institutional reality of the imperial theaters at the time. The premiere on January 30th, 1862, was recorded as an enormous success.
Which ensured that the pharaoh's daughter immediately secured a permanent place right at the very top of the imperial ballet's repertoire. This immediate, undeniable popular success was a critical, life-altering moment for Petipa personally.
And here is where the political and artistic history just merge into one career-defining moment. When Petipa staged this enormous, successful production, he was technically only serving as the assistant ballet master.
He was the understudy choreographer, essentially.
Right. He's an assistant to Arthur St. Leon, who is the premier maître de ballet, the chief choreographer of the entire imperial system. Petipa was not the top guy yet.
No, not at all. But the immense popular appeal of the pharaoh's daughter gave the Imperial Theater Directorate no choice. They had to recognize Petipa's genius and his popular command.
And the success of this one ballet earned him a critical promotion.
He was awarded the position of second maître de ballet. This was a crucial institutional step that just cemented his career trajectory. He would hold this role until St. Leon left Russia in 1869, at which point Petipa assumed the top choreographic position.
And defined the next 4 decades of ballet history.
Exactly.
So a sprawling 4-hour spectacle about an opium dream directly translated into political leverage and a key institutional position. It's a huge professional leap based on pure spectacle and undeniable popular appeal.
And the success wasn't accidental, it was absolutely designed for maximum impact. We have to look at the principal dancers, because this entire staging was created specifically as a benefit performance for the Italian ballerina Carolina Rosati.
And Rosati was a massive international star, wasn't she?
A huge star, and the
Yeah.
benefit performance structure meant that the role had to be spectacular, challenging, and dramatic enough to draw a huge audience. That would maximize her share of the box office revenue. Petipa had to design a work that could compete with anything else on the European stage.
And he succeeded by giving Rosati the immensely demanding central role of Princess Aspicia.
And it's also fascinating to remember that Petipa himself danced the principal male role, Lord Wilson Tower, opposite Rosati in this monumental premiere.
And the source notes that this specific performance, the one that launched his career as a maître de ballet, was actually his last professional role as a dancer.
Think about the symbolism of that moment. He finishes his career as a performer right there on stage in the very work that established his superiority as a choreographer.
So he literally steps off the stage as a performer and immediately assumes a higher, defining leadership role based on the work he just created.
It's a perfect handoff from one stage of his career to the next.
And the importance of the work didn't diminish, did it? He later revived the work multiple times, in 1885 and again in 1898.
Which just demonstrates its enduring importance to the repertoire even decades after his initial triumph. It kept his name and his structural innovations front and center for a very long time.
To really understand why this seemingly chaotic ballet was such a profound success and why it resonated so deeply, we need to place it firmly within its artistic and cultural context.
Right. We mentioned the concept of ballet, a grand spectacle. That was the defining theatrical trend of this era.
And we should probably define that a bit more fully. Ballet, a grand spectacle, meant an almost overwhelming focus on magnitude.
It was about rivaling the massive set pieces and the dramatic flair you'd see in grand opera. This choreographic trend demanded that the work be visually stunning, dramatically over the top, and utilize every single resource the imperial stage had at its disposal.
So specifically, this meant intense dramatic contrasts.
Exactly. The contrast between the dark, gloomy pyramids and the vibrant underwater kingdom. The contrast between the highly technical classical soloists like Rosati and the massive corps de ballet that were used for visual effects, like the 400 people on stage.
The scale itself was the selling point.
It was. They used cutting-edge stage machinery, elaborate flying rigs, pyrotechnics, extensive lighting techniques, all to make the fantastical elements, like the Kingdom of the Rivers or the terrifying Simum, feel totally real to the audience.
The 4-hour runtime alone is a defining characteristic of this maximalist era. Audiences expected a full evening of immersive, high-stakes drama and dazzling visuals.
But the subject matter, this obsession with ancient Egypt, wasn't just a random choice. It was a direct reflection of a contemporary European fascination.
That's right. The mid-19th century was gripped by Egyptomania.
Which was fueled by major archaeological discoveries, often driven by French and English explorers. This intense interest provided Petipa with the perfect backdrop for the Pharaoh's daughter.
And the literary source, Théophile Gautier's Le Roman de la Momie, provided the perfect foundation for this literary exoticism.
Gautier's work offered several key romantic elements. You had the passionate love story of the Pharaoh's daughter and Tahor, but blended, crucially, with the Gothic taste for dark tombs and gloomy corridors.
Which added an element of delicious danger to the romance.
It did, and the genius, or maybe the psychological device of the work, is that sense of the fantastic. It's the use of a border state between reality and dream. This is what allows those earthly passions, the pursuit, the love, the sacrifice, to be played out without the constraints of logic or geography.
And this is where the opium device becomes so much more than just a cheap plot twist. The source notes that Gautier, and by extension Petipa, used an artifact from the past, or, critically, a puff of opium, to add a brighter aura to his characters.
It sets them squarely on the borderline between life and death, between the waking world and the spiritual past, which is where all Egyptian art in this romantic interpretation supposedly took its nourishment.
So the role of opium here is not just a narrative convenience, it's a cultural indicator.
It really is. Opium was a highly visible, recognized, familiar influence in the works and lives of contemporary artists. You have figures like Thomas de Quincey, author of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, and many other Romantic-era writers. It was an accepted cultural trope for enabling deep fantasy, for justifying these huge geographical leaps, temporal shifts, and the kind of overwhelming imagery required for a grand spectacle.
And significantly, the creators used irony to keep the whole thing from stinking into overwrought 4-hour melodrama.
Yes, Gautier, and consequently the ballet, frequently use irony. It often had an anticlimactic effect, so as not to overwhelm his readers with terror or just drown the piece in seriousness.
But the specific ironic moments that the source highlights are crucial for appreciating the tone, I think.
They are. Take Lord Wilson, who is defined as the quintessence of Englishness. He's portrayed as impassively trying to sketch the desert scene, even as the violent simoom, that massive sandstorm, is actively disturbing his view.
That is peak 19th century colonial detachment.
But it's framed ironically. It's mocking the aloofness of the traveler.
Or what about the moment of Aspicia's supernatural awakening? After millennia of lying preserved in her sarcophagus, she finally awakens, looks into a mirror.
A mirror that's just conveniently there for her.
And is pleased to find herself as pretty as she was a few millennia before. It injects this very human, almost vain touch into a supernatural awakening.
And it tempers the potential awe or terror with lightheartedness. This balance of grand scale, exotic setting, drug-induced fantasy, and ironic distance is precisely what made it such a huge, accessible, and entertaining hit in 1862.
The immense scale of the production was successful, sure, but the lasting impact of The Pharaoh's Daughter is really found in Petipa's structural innovations. He didn't just stage a hit, he changed the structure of classical ballet forever.
He did it through his use of the divertissement.
This is a fundamental turning point in the history of dance. Petipa fundamentally changed the aesthetic and practical requirements of classical ballet by inserting the divertissement.
These were self-contained displays of pure dance, often folklore or technical showpieces, and they were sometimes symbolic, but often had only a loose, almost unnecessary connection to the main narrative structure.
It sounds a little counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To stop the high-stakes plot of Tahor and Aspicia just to watch a random dance.
It does, but it served a massive dual purpose, one autistic and one deeply practical, that solved some key problems facing the imperial stage at the time.
Okay, let's start with the artistic purpose.
The divertissement was a way to showcase the talent of Russian-trained dancers. This was hugely important because, at the time, the imperial theaters constantly imported massive foreign guest artists.
Like the lead, Carolina Rosati.
Exactly. And they inevitably dominated the spotlight. So the divertissement was essentially mandatory stage time for the home team.
So the Russian dancers who formed the bulk of the corps de ballet and the rising soloists, they couldn't necessarily be cast as the Pharaoh's Daughter.
No, or the major foreign leads. But they could be the river spirits, or the national dancers, or the abstract jewels in a pure dance sequence. It gave the Russian dancers a chance to shine and display their own talents without undermining the star vehicle status of the foreign principal artist.
So it turned a potential weakness, this reliance on foreign stars, into a strength by creating designated show-stopping moments for local virtuosity.
And the practical purpose was just as crucial, particularly in a production that ran for 4 hours and demanded such intensity from the leads.
Right. These breaks gave the principal dancers, like Rosati, necessary time to recover.
To change their immensely detailed and heavy costumes, refresh their delicate satin shoes, or simply create essential scene breaks for the massive mechanical set changes that were required for the grand spectacle.
We need to put that in perspective for you listening. Imagine Rosati dancing for nearly 3 hours in heavy, ornate 19th century costumes. That 5 or 10 minutes of ensemble dancing during the Kingdom of the Rivers is not just for a costume change.
No, it's a necessary recovery period for her feet, her stamina, and for her hair and makeup team. Petipa was solving practical theatrical problems with choreography.
And we connect this to the bigger picture. This is the element of the Pharaoh's Daughter that Petipa carried forward into every single one of his subsequent masterpieces. This technique became his signature.
Absolutely. Petipa started putting these self-contained divertissements in all of his major ballets that followed. We're talking about the Act 3 wedding sequence in The Sleeping Beauty,
The national dances in Swan Lake.
the Kingdom of the Shades in La Bayadère, and so on. The divertissement became a standardized, signature Petipa technique. It was adopted by countless choreographers afterward, and it established the structure of the multi-act grand ballet that we recognize and study today.
And the most spectacular example in The Pharaoh's Daughter is, without question, that fantastical pageant at the bottom of the Nile we talked about.
It is the ultimate expression of the folkloric divertissement.
The visual spectacle of the Neva and the Guadalquivir dancing together. The spirit of the Nile summons great rivers from entirely disparate parts of the world.
And they all arrive dressed up in their national costumes to dance for Aspecia. This is Petipa's deep penchant for folklore and national character dance, enhanced through elaborate costume and staging, showcasing a dazzling array of techniques and styles.
And this really illustrates the structural freedom Petipa allowed himself. This dance sequence, while visually beautiful, has almost nothing to do with whether Tahor lives or dies.
Or whether Aspecia gets to marry him. It exists purely as a vehicle for dance and spectacle.
Yet, the source notes that while Petipa indulged in folklore and spectacle, the overall production was criticized for its historical inaccuracy and the mixing of styles.
Especially outside of St. Petersburg and places like Moscow.
Right. Even in spite of the general taste for grand sets and costumes, reinvented with a minimum of realism and a maximum of grandeur, the critiques were there from the very beginning. Petipa was taking massive artistic liberties.
That tension between historical fantasy and choreographic opulence is absolutely central to the work and its reception. It's what allowed for the spectacle, but it's also what set the stage for later controversies regarding authenticity and representation.
That initial critique of historical accuracy and the blending of styles brings us sharply to the legacy and the controversies that have defined the ballet's history.
Particularly concerning the costuming and representation.
Right. The attempt to reflect Egyptian nationality through costuming was part of the exoticism that was so popular, but it ran into immediate artistic and social problems.
The sources detail a new wave of costuming for the production, where the newly shortened romantic tutu was decorated with Egyptian jewelry and ornamentation. This was intended to give the audience an authentic Egyptian feel.
To reflect Egyptian nationality while remaining suitable for classical technique.
But the conflict was inherent and unavoidable. Authenticity was immediately compromised for opulence. The goal was always to look rich, expensive, and dazzling, which often meant ignoring historical accuracy in favor of theatrical grandeur.
And this brings us to the deeply problematic element that exists in the historical record of this production.
The costuming choices highlighted a clear visual and social dichotomy within the production. The principal leads, the massive European guest artists like Rosati and Petipa, they were dressed in beautiful, expensive costumes, reflecting European standards of grandeur and nobility.
However, the ensemble dancers in the nationalistic dances, the specific parts designed to showcase the exotic folklore, were often visually distinguished from the leads through historically offensive methods.
The sources confirm that these dancers could be covered in blackface to denote them as foreign or exotic in the context of 19th century performance.
So the spectacle, which was meant to inspire a feeling of Egyptian exoticism, ended up being constructed on entirely offensive performance elements.
It visually and racially distinguished the noble European-style leads from the ensemble performing the exotic dances, often through racist performance methods and characterization. This is a painful but essential reminder of the 19th century cultural context from which this foundational art form emerged.
It's necessary context for any analysis of historical art. The grandeur of the spectacle was built in part on cultural appropriation and racist performance practices that were common in the time period.
And beyond the costuming issues, the artistic interpretation of the lead role, Aspecia, itself evolved significantly over time. It demonstrates Petipa's willingness to adapt his choreography to the strengths of different star ballerinas.
We can trace this evolution clearly, can't we? The role was created for Carolina Rosati, and her interpretation focused heavily on drama and powerful emotion.
She was an actress dancer. She excelled in the complex narrative scenes of love, fear, and high courage, especially that climax where she threatens the cobra, that classic high-stakes Cleopatra gesture.
And then 20 years later, the role was taken up by Virginia Zucchi, another formidable star, but she shifted the interpretation.
She portrayed a more humane, less arrogant princess, pulling the character away from the purely dramatic, regal style of Rosati toward a more relatable emotional complexity.
And then, toward the end of the century, we arrive at Mathilde Kishestinskaya,
who is perhaps the epitome of the burgeoning virtuosity of Imperial Russian ballet technique. She transformed Aspecia into a major virtuoso vehicle. It demanded incredible technical difficulty and speed.
So under her influence, the role became less about acting and more about the dazzling display of pure ballet technique.
Exactly. Petipa even staged his final revival in 1898, specifically as a benefit performance for her, tailoring the steps to her spectacular talents.
This shift is so crucial for understanding the history of classical technique. It shows the evolution of the ballerina ideal, from a dramatic actress to a technical marvel, something Chesnskaya absolutely embodied.
And she set the stage for the 20th century.
And thankfully, this 1898 production, the last one Petipa directly oversaw, was meticulously preserved.
The source confirms that the choreography and the elaborate staging, the mise-en-scène for that Petipa revival, were documented in choreographic notations, the famous Stepanov notation,
which are preserved in the Sergeyev collection at Harvard University. This set of records is essentially the Rosetta Stone for modern revivals.
That notation became the basis for the ballet's revival beyond the Russian Revolution. Although Alexander Gorsky staged a modified, unauthorized production in 1905 for the Bolshoi Ballet that continued until 1928, it was the preserved notation that allowed for true historical reconstruction decades later.
It gives us a window back to Petipa's exact intentions.
And the major modern revival we need to highlight is Pierre Lecotte's 2000 restaging for the Bolshoi Ballet.
Lecotte based his work partly on that Stepanov notation recording of Petipa's final production, but also on personal recollections and oral histories of Russian dancers who remembered earlier productions.
It successfully brought the work back into the regular repertoire after a long absence.
And most recently, we have the 2023 historical reconstruction by choreographer Tony Candeloro for the Mariinsky Theater. This production was directly based on the original Stepanov notation.
Candeloro's work was informed by his extensive research. He'd worked with dancers trained by major figures who carried the imperial traditions forward, like Lyubov Igorova, Olga Preobrazhenskaya, and Kresnskaya herself.
So Candeloro is clearly positioned as a specialist in preserving the deep structure of the late imperial theater and the ballet's Russ's traditions.
His 2023 revival ensures that this grand, sprawling piece reflects the intended structure and movement of Petipa's final staging, even acknowledging that the original structure mixed styles and lacked historical accuracy from the start.
The endurance of the Pharaoh's Daughter is truly remarkable. It stands from the mid-19th century, through its preservation efforts in the early 20th, all the way to the grand modern stages of the 21st century in Russia.
It's a historical time capsule of classical ballet's development.
So after this massive, chaotic, opium-fueled journey into ancient Egypt, what are the ultimate takeaways for the curious learner today?
Well, what we have here is a massive, often confusing, and historically complex spectacle that nonetheless provided the fundamental scaffolding for all of classical ballet that followed.
It laid the groundwork for the most celebrated narrative works, the great 3- and 4-act ballets, through Petipa's institutionalization of the divertissement and its complete embrace of high drama and technical display.
The enduring value of The Pharaoh's Daughter is that it shows us classical ballet right at the moment of its maximalist birth. It's where the spectacle became formalized, where the artistic demands on the ensemble became institutionalized.
And where Petipa cemented his creative control and developed the structural tools he would use for the rest of his career.
And for you, the curious learner, knowing that the structural elements of a technical masterpiece like The Sleeping Beauty or the intense drama of La Bayadère share DNA with this opium-fueled fantasy provides incredible context.
You're watching a highly polished, technically mastered modern revival. But its origins are rooted in a bizarre time travel adventure that begins with a sandstorm and a character named John Bull.
It makes those technical flourishes and those moments where the plot seems to stop for pure dance feel less like random filler and more like essential, intentional building blocks of the imperial style.
We can appreciate the virtuosity of a modern Aspecia, while understanding that the role had to evolve radically, from a dramatic vehicle for Rosati to a technical vehicle for Keshenskaya, just to keep pace with the changing demands of the audience.
The history of this ballet also forces us to confront the difficult intersection of cultural appropriation and artistic creation in the 19th century. The fact that its exoticism relied on elements that were culturally insensitive and potentially racist.
Like the use of blackface in the nationalistic dances.
Even while the leads were draped in opulence, that tension is part of the work's DNA.
That structural conflict, this brilliant structure built on a flawed foundation, leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to explore on your own. Given the detailed, precise information preserved in the Stepanov notation, the movement, the structure, the exact blocking and staging modern choreographers performing historical reconstructions.
Like Tony Candeloro's 2023 Mariinsky production.
They have a complex decision to make.
When they are charged with bringing a work back to life, how do they approach the dual reality? How do they balance respecting the past structure, the precise steps and mise en scène meticulously recorded in the Stepanov notation, which is historically sacred, with the practical obligation to address the cultural inaccuracies and the inherent racism present in the original 19th century staging?
They must choose where to draw the line between historical fidelity and modern responsibility. It's the enduring challenge of staging historical work that is structurally brilliant but ethically complicated.
A true deep dive into history always reveals layers of discomfort beneath the grandeur, and The Pharaoh's Daughter is a spectacular and influential example of just that.